From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We want to remove him, eliminate him. We don't want him anymore right here in our area. We need another organization, another system. Now we have the freedom. We don't want oil or money.
Resistance in Libya as Gaddafi forces launch new assaults to regain control of towns captured in a popular uprising over the past 2 weeks. We'll get the latest and speak with Horace Campbell of Syracuse University. Then, while the U.S. has sharply criticized Libya for its assault on protesters, it has remained noticeably silent on a recent crackdown in Iraq. 29 people were killed, hundreds arrested in protests. Then here in the U.S., labor protests are spreading.
I know that the marketing side of this has been sent out that the evil unions are just trying to protect their lazy teachers or whatever, but that's just not the way it is. With this bill, the teachers would be unable to negotiate the length of the school day or year, class sizes, or curriculum.
From high school students to state senators, from Idaho to Wisconsin to Ohio to Indiana, people are taking to the streets as Republican lawmakers attempt to push through legislation aimed at crushing public employee unions. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Labor protests are continuing across parts of the country, from Idaho to Indiana, as Republican lawmakers advance legislation aimed at crushing public employee unions. In Ohio, thousands rallied in Columbus to oppose a bill that would end collective bargaining rights for state employees. The measure is even more far-reaching than a similar bill in Wisconsin, in that it also would affect police officers and firefighters. A vote would come as early as today. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker has unveiled a budget slashing aid to schools and local districts, cutting an estimated 12,000 jobs. Critics say the plan would devastate Wisconsin's public education system, with predictions of schools being forced to cram up to 60 students into a classroom. Democratic State Assembly member Tamara Grigsby said the measure would cause, quote, an annihilation of education in this state. As Walker spoke, protesters could be heard outside the chamber chanting for him to be recalled from office. Most demonstrators remain barred from entering the Capitol building. We'll have more from Ohio and Wisconsin later in the broadcast. Forces loyal to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi have launched new assaults to regain control of a number of towns captured in a popular uprising over the past 2 weeks. Attacks have been reported today in Brega and the nearby town of Adabia. At a hospital in the rebel-held town of Benghazi, a doctor said up to 250 people have been killed in fighting so far.
About 220 to 250 is died. We say that from 220 to 150 because about 30 to 35 are without names. And it taking from the recorded of the hospital, where doctors, we just say the truth. This is, we are responsible for every war we're talking about.
2 U.S. warships have moved through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean towards Libya under orders from Defense Secretary Robert Gates. In Washington, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says the U.S. hasn't ruled out military intervention.
And we are taking no options off the table so long as the Libyan government continues to turn its guns on its own people. The entire region is changing, and a strong and strategic American response is essential. In the years ahead, Libya could become a peaceful democracy, or it could face protracted civil war, or it could descend into chaos. The stakes are high.
The United Nations General Assembly has voted, meanwhile, to suspend Libya from the UN Human Rights Council. The unanimous vote marked the first day any nation has been suspended from the Council since its formation in 2006. The U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, praised the move.
This is the first time that either the Human Rights Council or its predecessor, the Human Rights Commission, have suspended any member state for gross violations of human rights. And we think this is an important step forward in enhancing the credibility of the Human Rights Council, whose credibility on these issues has often quite legitimately been called into question.
The Venezuelan government has voiced criticism of Libya's expulsion but did not vote to block it. Venezuelan envoy Jorge Valero accused the U.S. of seeking a pretext for military intervention.
Venezuela llama a rechazar esa movilización guerrerista.
Venezuela calls for the rejection of warmongering mobilization of the U.S. Air Force and Navy in the Mediterranean Sea.
La utilización de la fuerza militar en contra de Libia.
Those who promote the use of military force against Libya do not seek to defend human rights, but rather, as always, to establish a protectorate and pillage the most important sources of oil and energy in the Middle Eastern region.
Anti-government protests have erupted in Iran for the third time in 2 weeks. On Tuesday, tens of thousands gathered in the streets of Tehran and other cities in what organizers called the largest and most violent protests this year. Riot police and undercover militias reportedly used tear gas, batons and bullets against the crowds. The rallies followed the arrest last week of 2 key Iranian opposition leaders. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets in Yemen Tuesday to demand the removal of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Opposition leaders described the demonstrations as the largest of Saleh's 3 decades in office. In a defiant speech, Saleh blamed the U.S. and Israel for the unrest, saying they were intentionally seeking to destabilize Yemen. At least 24 people have been killed in protests over the past 2 weeks.
We won't be scared no matter how many President Saleh kills, how many he jails, how many he tortures. We will die as martyrs and go to paradise, and he will go to hell. May this president fail. May this corrupt regime fail.
A Pakistani cabinet member has been assassinated in the capital of Islamabad. Minorities Minister Shahbaz Bhatti was ambushed by gunmen while driving to work earlier today. Bhatti had been a vocal critic of blasphemy laws that impose the death penalty for insulting Islam. The House has avoided a government shutdown with the passage of short-term legislation cutting $4 billion in federal spending. The measure creates a 2-week window for lawmakers and the White House to negotiate a follow-up bill, which will set spending levels for the remainder of the fiscal year. The Supreme Court has ruled corporations have no right to personal privacy when it comes to government documents released under the Freedom of Information Act. The unanimous decision bears on the telecom giant AT&T's effort to prevent the release of government documents in a case with the FCC dating back to 2004. AT&T had argued it should be exempted from the Freedom of Information Act request because corporations are defined as persons under U.S. law. A new study says 19 struggling U.S. states stand to lose as much as $5.3 billion in tax collections over the next few years as a result of President Obama's recent tax deal with Republicans. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the unintended losses would come from a provision allowing businesses to deduct the full value of new equipment costs. Newly disclosed figures show wastewater produced from the natural gas drilling practice of hydrofracking has contained radioactivity and other contaminants at levels far exceeding federal limits. According to the New York Times, internal government documents show at least 15 wells produce wastewater with more than 1,000 times the amount of radioactive elements considered acceptable. The wastewater is sometimes brought to sewage plants equipped to properly heat it, and then dispersed into rivers supplying drinking water. At least 12 sewage plants in 3 states discharge partly treated wastewater and waste into rivers and streams. The documents also show government regulators and industry officials knew of the problems with the wastewater disposal and treatment, but took no action. On Tuesday, protesters rallied following a New York City Council hearing on plans to open parts of New York State watershed to drilling. This is Joe Levine of the group New York H2O.
They know it's contaminating, and they're doing it anyway. The 18,000 wells is a projection. There could likely be very many more than 18,000 wells. They haven't been approved. They would be allowed to proceed if these regulations are completed and put out. So once they complete these regulations, gas drilling will be able to commence in the Delaware River Basin.
And House Democrats are urging the investigation of a Washington law firm and 3 private security companies hired to undermine political opponents of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In a letter to 4 House committees, Democratic lawmakers accuse lobbying firm Hunton & Williams of using subversive tactics to smear the Chamber's critics. Leaked emails indicate Hunton & Williams solicited private security firms Palantir Technologies, H.B. Gary Federal, and Berico Technologies to propose a strategy for weakening progressive and labor groups that have challenged the Chamber's lobbying for some of the nation's biggest corporations. H.B. Gary Federal Chief Executive Aaron Barr, whose emails helped fuel the controversy, announced his resignation this week. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.